Hi, welcome to this episode of The Daily. My name is Brendan Malone. Let me start by asking you a question. Do you know the difference between investigative journalism and advocacy journalism? Now, the reason I ask that is because this is becoming more and more of an issue. Now, let me explain. Investigative journalism, which is generally understood as journalism that goes a bit more in depth on issues, more time is taken, more footwork and investigative work is done to try and bring a complete and total picture of an issue or a story or a political policy or whatever the case might be. It's a hugely important area of journalism. It's profoundly important for a healthy functioning democracy to have a good and vibrant investigative journalism community that is following good ethical and professional standards and that is doing its job well. It really matters. Now, so it is a bit of an issue, the fact that this is a dying art, a dying profession, and we're not seeing as much of it as we used to. A lot of reasons for this. Maybe in a future episode of The Daily, I'll try and explain some of the big reasons why we are seeing this happen, but it's not a good thing. Now, what we're seeing, though, instead of investigative journalism, is we are seeing the rise of what people are calling advocacy journalism. However, I'm not convinced it's even authentic advocacy journalism. Let me explain what I mean. Advocacy journalism, I think, is really all about a journalist or a media outlet that decides that there's an issue or an injustice or something that needs a special media focus. And so they focus in on that issue or that person or that situation, and they give it a bit more detailed coverage, and they try and unpack the issue more fully. Now, in the process, though, because obviously they've taken a particular side, they're starting from a belief that there's an injustice here that demands their attention and that the public should be made aware of. So there's clearly a strong bias here, not just reporting facts anymore. Now, that's okay as long as it's balanced by journalistic balance. So if you are watching a documentary, for example, and you are presented with both sides of an issue or both sides of an ideology, and there's fair balance given, there's no trickery in the editing, one side is not completely excluded, they actually give you a balanced presentation of the case and the facts, then guess what? You are able to make a good and informed decision. And if there really is a genuine injustice here, then guess what? Society is likely to get on board and say, hey, we need to do something about this. So the key factor there is that there is still this journalistic ethics and professionalism taking place, even though there is advocacy happening. But what we're seeing a lot more of today is not what I think is advocacy journalism. Instead, it's just straight out advocacy, which is effectively propaganda. You are advocating for a particular position, a particular ideology, or a particular person's cause, but you are not doing it with any sort of balance. You are not presenting and giving equal and fair airtime to both sides or all parties involved in an issue. Instead, you are simply just pushing one particular wheelbarrow and quite strong. And I think this is really quite an important issue. I'll give you an example of this. I was watching a documentary the other night, which was presented as being about one thing, this idea of people who are basically lobbyists who pretend to be experts, but are nothing more than lobbyists. They're paid experts who turn up and politically influence things with their testimony. Now, this was interesting to me because there's a whole lot of reasons why I'd find this interesting and why I think this is an important area to explore. And particularly if you think about the healthy functioning of a democracy. It's not good having people pretending and presenting false information and presenting information under false pretenses. So, I watched the documentary. The first 5 or 10 minutes or so seemed okay. It's about the tobacco industry and how in the past they'd done this sort of trickery around lobbying. Then it very quickly changes gears, and all of a sudden it turns out the documentary is not actually about experts who present themselves as being something other than they are. Instead, it's all about the issue of climate change, and the documentary filmmakers are clearly advocating for one particular view on this issue. They have taken a very strong and clear stance. But, and I don't mind that, but the point is that they have tried to present this documentary as if it's an independent expert analysis of what's going on. But for those of us who know anything about these issues and in practice have followed the media and all the different arguments and debates that have gone on about it over the years, it was pretty clear that there's no balance here. There's a total lack of balance. And this is not really advocacy journalism. This is certainly not investigative journalism. Not only that, but there was one particular expert who was interviewed throughout this documentary. And it was only when I went and did subsequent research away from watching this documentary that I actually discovered that the documentary was just a filmed presentation of a book or some papers that she'd already written on these issues. Now, the documentary doesn't tell you that. The documentary presents her as if she's some independent expert who's just being interviewed by these independent filmmakers, when clearly this is her work that is being presented. And I think this sort of dishonesty is not good for a whole lot of reasons. A, it's just dishonest, and it creates problems further down the track. If people do discover the real facts, they're far more skeptical about any sort of investigative journalism as a result. Secondly, this sort of deception, actually, you might think you're doing a good thing and you're benefiting your cause, but I think it harms democracy. People still have the right, I think, because of their personhood and their personal autonomy and their dignity and their rational intellect and their free will, to actually be informed properly and correctly and accurately with all of the facts and then make a decision, not just to be fooled or tricked into thinking that only one side of this particular story or situation is true. Now, I think one of the best things you can do, if you've watched a documentary or you've read a report or you've read an article and it just seems too good to be true, and what I mean by that is that you look at this and you're asking yourself, well, how the heck can this be happening? And there's no obvious explanation for why this injustice or problem should be taking place. So, for example, we're not living in some sort of tin pot dictatorship where they do this to people or they handle their political policies like this with all sorts of corruption as a matter of routine. So, this seems really totally out of touch with the reality of your society in which you live. It seems totally out of touch with the reality of the human experience. And you're thinking to yourself, why isn't anybody doing something about this? Because it's so obvious there's a problem here. Then I would encourage you to go and do some wider reading. Because if you haven't heard both sides of the story, another thing to look out for is documentaries that don't give all sides equal airtime, or don't give any airtime at all to the other side of a debate or an issue or a situation. Once again, what you need to do is go and read more widely about that particular situation or issue or ideology. And what you might be surprised to discover is, more often than not, in actual fact, there are a whole lot of important facts that were missing from that particular presentation that you never received. And you need those facts in order to be able to make an informed decision. It's been my experience more often than not, I find this particularly when it comes to true crime documentaries and other things, that if you go and do a bit more investigation, when you're thinking, well, why could a sheriff do this? And why would the Justice Department do this to someone? Or why would the courts treat a person like that? When in actual fact you do a bit more reading, you discover the case is a lot more complex, and the case against the supposedly innocent person is a lot stronger than you were first led to believe. But it's not just in that area of crime that this is an issue. There's a whole lot of journalistic presentation going on now, and a whole lot of documentary presentation going on now that is little more than the presentation of propaganda. And so it is important to read more widely and read a lot more sources than just those advocating for one side of an issue. Thanks for watching. I'll see you tomorrow on The Daily.